This video is to show the second part of making a strap for your messenger bag. So in the first part, I put my fashion and lining strip pieces together. So first I individually sewed the short sides of my fashion and then my lining, and then I laid those pieces together and I sewed down my long sides to create one big tube. Then the piece that I didn't show you that I pre-finished before I started this one is that while it was still inside out, I pressed open my seam allowances. And kind of the best way to do this while it's still inside out is to press one seam allowance to the side, because when this is flat, it's impossible to get both pieces open and flat unless you have something really skinny that you can put inside the tube that you've created. Maybe you have an arm board or something like that at your sewing station. I don't here, also that may not be skinny enough to fit inside of this. So it actually works well if you just flip one of the pieces of seam allowances inward and press that so that you are still opening this seam well. Then you want to turn the entire tube. I turned mine with my fingers. It's wide enough to do that. If you're turning a skinnier tube, sometimes you can use a tube turner. They make a set of poles and rods that you kind of stuff the pieces through and together. Our costume shop owns tube turners, but again, I don't have that with me right now, so I just did it by hand. If you have a really skinny tube that's hard to turn, you can also anchor a safety pin in one corner or one end, and then use the safety pin to help feed with your fingers through. That works really well when we get into drawstrings and things later, and you've got a really teeny tiny skinny tube to turn. So for the strap, I turn this right side out. Then I go back to the iron again. You are not done with your ironing. Good ironing makes better sewing, so you cannot skip those portions. And you can tell that this is kind of poofy on this side and rolling up. I did not iron this portion. So it got ironed. It got one seam allowance flipped while it was inside out. But once I flipped it to the right side, I didn't iron that side down. I did, however, iron the opposite side. So you can see that this side is much crisper and neater. So I laid it flat on my ironing board. It's hard to show you here, but I laid it flat on my ironing board, and I made sure that this seam was right on the edge there as I was ironing. So I was making sure with my fingers that everything was rolled appropriately and that I wasn't accidentally, because this can happen really easily, rolling in some of the seam allowances and like creating another fold. That happens all the time. Don't do that. Make sure your seam is all the way pushed out and kind of pull it out and crisp it up with your fingers and then run over it with the iron so that you make sure you have a nice, neat, flat edge so the seam is right on the very edge there. So you're going to press both sides, both long sides like that. So I've pressed this one to show you, and show you the unpressed one that's kind of loose and poofy right now. So I'll go back and fix that in a moment. But I want to show you the finishing technique to this strap piece. So the last thing you want to do after you get everything ironed and flat, both sides, is to go ahead and guide this under your sewing machine, and you're going to top stitch through all your layers. So a top stitch, again, like the pockets, is reinforcement. It's going to be seen, so make sure your thread color is a wise choice. It's also going to keep these edges nice and flat and stable to add that additional top stitching through these seam allowances. So here we go. So my directions say to top stitch at 1/4 inch. That means that I would line the outer edge of my presser foot right here. And I'm going to go ahead and use that presser foot edge as my guide the entire way. And again, if you've pressed this really well, it's nice and crisp with your iron. You have a nice folded pretty edge to sew against and keep everything straight and smooth. Okay, so you can go ahead and see, turn off my machine so it stops vibrating. You can see how nice and crisp this edge is now that I have reinforced it with that top stitch. Nice and crisp and even and smooth. So I'm going to go back off camera in a second and press this edge, iron this edge nice and flat like I did the opposite one, and stitch this. So I'll have a tube with double stitched long ends. You don't need to do anything with the short ends right now. Again, those will be finished later when we assemble the rest of the bag.